Okay, so today's top 5 moral panics, which I have collated from having a look around and seeing what the majority of people are talking about online and in the White House and amongst sort of populist parties. And then I want to compare those with the top 5 moral panics from 1966. And I'm getting the moral panics from 1966 from Stanley Cohen's book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, which was a kind of sociological analysis of moral panics, where they come from, and how people react to them. The 2026 moral panics, of course, are the mainstay. They're the bread and butter. They're the fuel of most of the channels that we look at online, because we need a good moral panic. It kind of feeds our ideas about the world being a dangerous, frightening place where people are out to get us. But let's compare and contrast. So Stanley Cohen, the first moral panic that he identified was mods and rockers. Now, you might remember mods and rockers, and this was where gangs of leather-jacketed youths on motorcycles and young men in green Parkers on Vespa Italian scooters would kind of face off, normally in a seaside resort like Brighton. And there was a famous film made about this called Quadrophenia. And those that weren't alive in those days probably don't realise just what a kind of horror story this was, and this was in the main papers. And why was it? Well, basically because it was the idea that youth culture was out of control, that there were these violent, immoral young men that were threatening social order. And so that was the moral panic that involved sort of youth. Moral panic number 2, 1966. Cannabis. Now, of course, there are certain people who will be named. Peter Hitchens, who is still having a moral panic about cannabis and has been for 40 years. There is hardly a day goes by without the Daily Mail getting a column written by Peter Hitchens about the fact that Britain is broken because of cannabis smokers. Obviously, I think Peter's lost his mind, and I would recommend you have a look at the parody website by Tony Lapidus, where he does a lot of great impressions of Peter Hitchens' extraordinary moral indignation and puffed up outrage. But back then, the Daily Mirror famously used to have pictures of young people smoking dope, as though this was literally the end of the world. I am not exaggerating. They thought that this would probably bring down society, that it was like a virus, much worse than coronavirus. Now, we all know since then that there are people who smoke cannabis are generally, they're neither a great hindrance on the health service, nor do they end up being psychotic, and nor do they do any great damage to those around them. And we know that this is just a kind of myth that's built up, which really is there to protect the alcoholics of this world, where I think 85% of people who are in jail are in there often because they have committed a crime while they're drunk. But there you go. All right, so it was the idea of the emerging drug culture, and that was going to destroy society, corruption of the young through drugs. Third one is just, I think generally, was juvenile delinquency. It was a worry about rising youth crime and a kind of breakdown in respect for authority. There was this idea back in the 60s that one was always in deference to authority. It didn't matter whether it was a police officer or a teacher or a headmaster, even though that headmaster, of course, was normally a paedophile, or often a paedophile, and if not a paedophile, he was somebody who was quite happy to dish out corporate punishment. That is beatings. And even when I was at school, to be honest, this was going on, okay? And so it was about then that kind of juveniles began, tipping the helmets off police officers. And of course, this was a terrible indictment of the way society was going. And this obviously went on in the 70s, of course, the Sex Pistols and the famous Bill Grundy interview, when they swore on TV, and this was kind of front page news for weeks and weeks and weeks. And bands like the Stranglers and the Sex Pistols and the Clash, they were often banned from venues and all this kind of thing. It was a moral panic about the state of youth, corrupted, if not by drugs, if not by cannabis or whatever, then by punk music. So 50, 60 years ago, we had these moral panics about the young. And of course, this went on into the early 80s, when there was this great fear of mugging. People were scared to go outside because of being mugged. Mugged basically meant that somebody came up to you and said, hand over your money, and they were carrying a knife. And there were people who were frightened to leave the house because of this kind of thing. So there was this idea that the youth were out of control, society was breaking down, there were street gangs, there were rebellious working class youths, and probably number 4, I would probably say, was gangs, youth gangs, okay. And number 5, of course, from the 60s, was sexual permissiveness. And maybe pornography, but mainly sexual permissiveness. The idea that people were suddenly sexually liberated in the 60s. This was traditional morality was collapsing. And I don't know whether you've noticed from the things I've been saying now, but they're all reflected today in the online, particularly the popular right community. It's exactly the same thing. This isn't from a year ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's the same themes from 60 years ago. It's always the end times in the life of these people. The families, I don't think families did collapse entirely, did they? Because of sexual permissiveness. You've got to remember in those days that women were not allowed to kind of display sexuality really without being abused and without being told they're a slag, and that kind of thing. So, whether it was good or bad, I'll leave that for you to decide. But there's a little bit of history. These were the fears that were in the press and amongst those in the politics about the state of the nation in 1966, the top 5. And let's have a look at the top 5, what I consider to be the top 5 today, and we'll see if there's any parallels between the two. I had to put a number 5, transgender people and gender ideology. And the reason I did that was because it's kind of such a minority thing. It really doesn't affect, 98% of us are completely unaffected by any of this. And yet it's getting 60, 70% of the airtime in certain areas. The idea now that the folk devils alive today are trans people. These are people who believe that they exist in the wrong body. And I've got personal experience about this with people I know. And most of the things that are said about transgender people are not only insensitive and wrong, it's a form of awful abuse, actually. But for some reason, we've blown this up and decided to make this into a moral panic to the point where now in America, tens of millions of people, the MAGA lot, say quite openly, I'm sick of parents sending their boy to school and he comes back as a girl. I'm sick of people sending their girl to school and they come back as a boy. It's a classic Stanley Cohen moral panic. They've invented a folk devil. Nothing exists. You might as well be talking about elves, gremlins and goblins. Really. But there you go. All right. Number 2, obviously, you know what I'm going to say. The moral panic today. The folk devils. The asylum seekers, the immigrants. The idea that there are millions of undocumented migrants on every street corner, usually ready to rape and kill and murder. I'm not saying that immigration isn't something that every government needs to address and think about and act and deal with. But, unfortunately, when you have a 20th century of such violence, and then a longer history of kind of a strange colonialism where countries are kind of carved up in strange ways, then it does sort of cause unrest. You can't expect America to go into Iraq twice, okay, and destabilise to such an extent the entire country and not expect there to be some consequence of that kind of thing. Okay, so there you go. So where's the fear? The fear is that our national identity is being undermined, and that also our safety is at threat. Our safety is at threat. Now, that's not to say this isn't an issue, but surrounding that issue, particularly from people like Farage, of course, and that lot, and of course in America, Trump and the ICE agents, I don't think they're making it any better, actually. I think that the moral panic, just like the moral panic serves to monetize certain channels, it also serves to increase one's political popularity. So there you go, number 2. Number 3, of course, has to be woke ideology. Now, woke is a strange one. Woke is a kind of pushback against the Enlightenment, really. The Enlightenment was the idea that we would become a kind of better society and that we would be fair and we would be egalitarian and reasonable, and we would allow for people's differences, and we wouldn't kind of hang black people, and we wouldn't chase gay people down the street and beat them back and boo. We wouldn't throw them in jail like they did to people like Oscar Wilde and many, many others, of course, thousands of others. People like Quentin Crisp would have to escape the UK to go to New York. But there's been a pushback against that very reasonable utopian idea. And now, of course, we don't like diversity programs. We're not even happy with meritocracy, really, or certainly egalitarian legislation which makes a level playing field for certain types of people. The idea that everybody who's born is a kind of entrepreneurial psychopath seems very unfair to me. I mean, obviously there are 7 or 8 million disabled people, I think, in UK alone, and the idea that they should be on a completely level playing field with somebody who's able-bodied, it's not always the case. Sometimes there is prejudice, and I don't see anything wrong, with organising, help for these people to overcome some of the natural prejudices that there are. But there you go. Apparently not. I'm wrong, as usual, of course. So the folk devils are the universities which sort of breed woke people, people who, fly the rainbow flag on, certain days of the year, and they don't like that kind of thing. And they don't like the idea that there are diversity programs. They hate programs like Doctor Who, because Doctor Who is a kind of woke program, isn't it? I mean, when you're introduced to the cast of a new series of Doctor Who, and when they come on screen for the first time, it's true, you've probably got somebody in a wheelchair, and a black person, and an Indian, and a white person, and a gay man, and a lesbian, and it does seem quite contrived. But having said that, isn't it good that people are included? That we don't kind of have certain people in society who have to kind of live in the shadow and the fog all the time. Well, you know how I feel about woke ideology. I think that it's an invented concept, actually. It's been invented by the right, and it's been an incredibly useful tool. I'm going to put number 4 about school indoctrination. The idea that sort of schools and universities are breeding grounds for Marxists. This is a moral panic put about online and in right-wing politics. The idea that children are being sort of politically indoctrinated from a young age. There are, they want to stick a Bible in the classroom and just do Bible studies. Yes, hello, Handmaid's Tale. Jordan Peterson wants to close all universities, and he wants to start up the Jordan Peterson University, which will be based on his 5 favourite books, all of which tell morality tales, the Cain and Abel's and that kind of thing, the thing that he talks about. He's read 5 books and he doesn't stop talking about them. But there you go. So school they'd be kind of like religious schools, in effect. And the universities, they would be, you'd have to get rid of all of the humanities. And I guess the only way a university could survive would be if it's a school for entrepreneurs. All right. And finally, obviously, I'm going to talk about crime. It's crime again. It doesn't matter how many times you tell people that statistically it's safer than it's ever been, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying that it is as safe as it could be, and I think there's lots of problems. Of course I do. I am no great utopian. I think the world is bloody broken like everybody else. But the idea that we're living in a lawless state, a chaotic state, a state where people should feel frightened to go out for all sorts of reasons, whether it be an asylum seeker or somebody on a motorcycle who's going to steal your home. Remember, all of everything bad that happens in the day is funneled through a screen into our minds. So there you go. Those are the top 5 from 1966 and my top 5 from 2026. And moral panics have been going on since time began. And in 1600s we had the witch trials. This is where women were rounded up and they were killed for being witches. And this was a great moral panic across the nation, particularly in the United States. And in the 1950s, of course, there was the Red Scare, and the idea that sort of communism was a creeping virus that was kind of hidden amongst the population. And I mean, we've had so many moral panics. I'm sure you can think of hundreds more over the time. I mean, there was even a time when comic books were a kind of panic in the mainstream press, and the idea that kids read comics, particularly superhero comics, and that somehow they were being corrupted. So what am I trying to say? Well, that's a good question. Obviously, I'm saying that the world has always had a history of moral panics. The moral panics that you often listen to now for an hour here or there on The Heretic or some other crazy YouTube channel, they're just part of a long history of moral panics which sell, which monetize, where you can kind of manipulate people by infusing them with fear, so that they're kind of attracted to you in some way, that you've got a kind of handle on it, you understand it, you can dissect it for them and maybe even find a way out for them. But no such thing. My advice is that one should try and find one's own moral compass in this world and not look outside for it.